Well, hi everyone. My name is Dr. Chris Wilson. I'm based at the Centre for Social Impact at Swinburne University, and that's where I do analysis for the Australian Digital Inclusion Index. The Australian Digital Inclusion Index project is a collaboration between Swinburne University, RMIT University, and Telstra, Australia's largest telecommunications company. And data is pushed into the project from the commercial research collection agency, Roy Morgan Research. What I want to do today is talk a little bit about digital inclusion and also a bit about the Digital Inclusion Index and the measurement of the capacities and inequalities in digital inclusion in Australia. I want to also link this into the notion that promoting digital inclusion on a personal level is one way to ensure that the digital transformation of businesses in the tourist sector and beyond really yield those benefits they're looking for. I'm going to do really three things today before making some concluding remarks. The first is to introduce the Australian Digital Inclusion Index, which I'll refer to from now on as the ADII, as a measure of personal digital inclusion. I'll then look at personal digital inclusion and the way it yields benefits or a dividend for tourism development. And then finally, I'll just provide some brief remarks about trends in digital inclusion in Australia. The ADII was developed in 2015 at the request of Telstra, who was seeking to measure or to develop a measure to understand how Australians were positioned overall to benefit from using the internet and the differences in that positioning for different groups in the community, and to use that measure to track changes over time. Previous measures of digital capacity had pointed to a digital divide between those who had access to the internet and those who did not. But as the internet has become more widely used, embedded in a range of digital interfaces from smartphones to cars, and more central to a range of commercial, social, creative, civic and government practices, it has become increasingly clear that a binary division based on access was not really enough to capture differing levels of benefit that people might be achieving through using the internet. Of course, those not accessing the internet at all remain in a position where they derive no direct benefit from this technology, and it's important to understand who they are and how many of them there are. Where the extent to which an individual is able to benefit from the internet is linked to a range of attributes that extend beyond simply having a means of accessing the internet. The ADII considers these attributes to fall within three broad dimensions: access, affordability, and abilities or skills. Measurable indicators of the attributes that feed the three dimensions are highly nuanced and really dig into, or allow us to really dig into, the variances in digital inclusion between people. So for access, for instance, it's not just about having a connection, but includes how often you access, where you access to different types of interfaces from phones to computers, whether you have subscriptions to mobile and or fixed broadband services, the quality, speed of those services, and also the volume of access you have in terms of data allowances. The affordability dimension looks at how much value for money you get from your expenditure, as well as what sort of pressures that expenditure is putting on your household budget. And in terms of digital abilities, we try to capture that through indicators of attitudes to technology, as well as participation in a range of online activities with different skill demands. So our survey research captures data from individuals on more than 100 indicators, and that is used to form an overall digital inclusion score for an individual and scores on each of the three dimensions. The scores range from 0 to 100, where 100 is theoretically a perfect level of inclusion. The data allows us to conduct geographic analysis and demographic analysis, and also to track trends over time, or changes over time. And we have data now that extends between 2014 and 2020. Now, I'm not going to show these in any great detail, but there is a list of the access and affordability and abilities indicators in the appendix of our annual reports, which you can find on our website. And there's a link at the end of this presentation. Before I talk about the ADII results, I just want to make a few comments about the ADII measure and digital inclusion that will help provide a link between that and the digital tourism agenda that we're really here today to talk about. First, it's important to note the scale of the ADII. It's a measure of personal digital inclusion, a way of measuring the overall level of capacity across the Australian population and inequality within it. Now, I know that understanding digital capacity and digital inequality at the organisation level or the regional infrastructure level is important in addressing industry level development. So, for instance, in the tourism industry, being discussed today, this would yield an understanding of where tourist businesses would need to invest in digital transformation and where regional telecommunications infrastructure upgrades might be necessary as a foundation for tourism development. That's beyond the scope of what the ADII does, but there are, of course, important intersections between personal, organisational and regional digital capacities. There's a really nice paper published some time back by two European academics, Mignetti and Borjalas, that provides an introductory model to help us conceptualise those interactions. It highlights how asymmetrical levels of digital inclusion at the personal, organisational, regional infrastructure level between tourist sources and tourist destinations can undermine tourism development. So, for example, consider where a tourist with high levels of digital inclusion and therefore expectations around connectivity visits a destination with poor telecommunications infrastructure and tourist businesses with limited digital capacity. Obviously, this will cause issues. Or consider the alternative. The barriers a tourist with low levels of digital inclusion might face in purchasing tourist services that are exclusively sold online by highly digitally capable organisations. Indeed, it is this link between personal digital inclusion and market opportunities and efficiencies that reveals the commercial dividend that can be achieved when high levels of digital inclusion and low levels of inequality are achieved across the entire community. It is a digital inclusion dividend that actually extends to government and all other organisations seeking to create new service provision opportunities and create efficiency gains through their own processes of digital transformation. It's no good if you transform digitally, but your customers are not there to meet you. And this is where the results of Australian Digital Inclusion Index can help us understand the nature and extent of this issue and how it might be addressed. Let's have a look at some results. I'll try to be brief. The ADII tells us that digital inclusion in Australia has improved over time. Essentially, the majority of the improvement occurred between 2015 and 2019. So the scores went up from 54 to 63 across the entire time period in which we cover. When we look at the individual dimensions of digital inclusion and where the improvements occurred, we see that it's really in the access dimension that we've seen the most change. And underpinning this has been investments in both fixed and mobile communications infrastructure. So in the late 2000s, the Australian federal government made a commitment to overhaul the fixed copper telecommunications network that had formed the backbone of broadband provision in Australia. And by the mid-2010s, we saw that new system being rolled out, called the National Broadband Network, or NBN. It included a combination of fibre and copper, cable, fixed wireless and satellite services. The rollout of the NBN had positive impact on the access dimension of digital inclusion in really three ways. First, NBN technology tended to be better than what was available. So if you had broadband, suddenly your broadband was improved. The second way was because the NBN didn't really augment existing broadband infrastructure, it replaced it. It meant that people had to take up new services on the NBN network. As a result of that, we saw people who didn't have fixed broadband suddenly decide they wanted to connect into the fixed broadband network. And for those that were on the network, what we saw was they got rid of their legacy data plans that they had with telecommunications company and may have been holding for years and took up new plans that often gave them more data and therefore a greater volume of access to the internet to expand their online engagement. In addition to the government-led fixed broadband infrastructure upgrade, we've also seen some real market investment in mobile network upgrades. We've seen the shift from fourth to fifth generation mobile networks, and of course an expansion of the transmission coverage itself. The federal government has played some role in this as well through what it calls the Mobile Black Spot program, which is really a co-investment program with the federal government, states and the commercial telecommunications organisations to build new base stations, really where there is limited or no coverage. And so that's been particularly important for rural and remote areas. And I'll talk a little bit about those areas in a moment. There's been really a consistent improvement there across people having mobile phone skills, as well as online shopping, banking and social networking skills. And the proportion of the population able to demonstrate skills related to more advanced activities like online transactions and audio-visual communications has also increased through the period. Despite these improvements, there's one thing that's really interesting, and that is the attitudinal barriers to digital inclusion. Less than half of all of Australians think that computers and technology give them more control over their lives, and less than 40% feel they can keep up with the changing technological landscape. And that's really not changed over the period of 6 years. For older Australians, it's even worse. Just over a quarter of people aged over 65 feel empowered by computers and technology, and just 1 in 8 feel they can keep up with technological changes. Now, this suggests a couple of things. First, efforts to increase digital abilities should not simply target skill building, but also help to build user confidence. Second, and pertinent to those engaged in digitally transforming commercial and other practices, including, of course, tourism businesses, it's important that when you build these transformational apps or software, that you design them in a way for usability and also have simple and effective online and offline help available to support users, and therefore make them more confident in using those technologies. I'm not going to say much about affordability, except that we're seeing households spending an increasing portion of their income on the internet access. And this does really reduce digital inclusion, particularly for those on low incomes. Despite the overall lift in digital inclusion scores across Australia, there continues to exist significant digital inequalities. One of those areas of inequality is really geographic, and between people living in cities and high urban density areas and those living in rural areas. There's a range of reasons for this, but one of them, of course, comes down to infrastructure. And while we've seen some improvements over the last few years in that with the rollout of the NBN and some mobile communications infrastructure, there is still a differential there. And we do have different NBN technologies with fixed wireless and satellite communication really being used in rural areas, which really is a lesser quality technology than the sort of optical fibre mix that's being used in the cities. So some things to think about there. The other thing, of course, is that the ADII reveals that there are real socioeconomic contours to digital inclusion. Effectively, those on lower incomes, those outside the labour force and those with less education have very low digital inclusion scores compared to others. Also, digital inclusion is overlaid by age, and particularly once we get into the 50+ group, we see a real decline in digital inclusion for those groups. For the over 65 group, it's particularly an issue around skill development. And so some real concerns there and issues to address if we want to see a broad and overall lifting of digital inclusion in Australia for all groups. So some concluding remarks. The first one is that digital inclusion is not just about having access to the internet, but a more complex, interrelated set of attributes in terms of access, skills and affordability, which together determine how digitally engaged an individual can be. Digital transformation is also an important way to create efficiencies and diversity of product offerings in the tourism sector, but it's vital that operators and policymakers understand the challenges that digital inclusion and digital inequality present to realising the benefits of this transformation. You must bring the customer with you. And that is a broader issue than just probably what you can do as a business, that you need governments to invest in those infrastructures, skill building opportunities and ensuring affordable access. Thirdly, while low levels of personal digital inclusion amongst tourists might reduce market opportunities for tourism operators, asymmetrical levels of digital inclusion at the personal, organisational and regional infrastructure level between tourist sources and tourist destinations can also undermine tourism development. So while levels of digital inclusion in Australia have risen, particularly through investment in telecommunication infrastructure, substantial digital inequalities persist here as they do elsewhere, and these are real issues that we need to start thinking about in terms of developing appropriate policies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to hand back, and hopefully this has provided some food for thought in terms of how digital inclusion is an important issue in this idea of building a digital tourism sector. Thanks very much.